Hey everybody, this is Rykard here again, and welcome to my 5th generation recap. With the Pokemon X and Y games coming around the corner in just 2 weeks, I felt like this would be a good time to kind of refresh our memory on some of the most influential abilities, moves, and Pokemon that were introduced into the Pokemon Black and White and Pokemon Black and White 2 games. So without any further waiting, let's just kick this off by talking about some of the best abilities that were introduced into these new 5th generation games. So as far as the 5th generation is concerned, many new abilities came about that added a greater level of depth to competitive battling and added a whole plethora of new strategies that could be implemented with your teams and with your Pokemon. So out of these 41 new abilities that were introduced into the Pokemon Black and White games, I decided to narrow it down to my top 5. So coming in at number 5 on this list is going to have to be Regenerator, because from a defensive standpoint, this ability was possibly one of the most useful for pretty much any defensive Pokemon. Pokemon like Slowbro, Slowking, Tangrowth, Alomomola, and even from an offensive standpoint, Mienshao, were able to significantly benefit from this ability and increase their staying power in battle, thus allowing them to continue to wall potential attackers and be very useful as a Pokemon to switch in on some powerful moves that your opponent was going for. Moving down to number 4, I would have to go with Magic Bounce, because this is possibly one of the best abilities in the game. There were only a couple of Pokemon that got it, which are Espeon and Xatu, but obviously this ability still, despite its low distribution, is one of the best in the game. It made you pretty much immune to every single type of non-attacking move. So both of these Pokemon that have it would not be able to be toxic, they would not be able to be status really directly. They could be status by a secondary effect, but no direct status. They couldn't be phased out, and they couldn't be taunted. Just all those types of things made this ability one of the best things in the game, and also made Espeon essentially the best baton passer in the game because it could not be phased out, or best baton pass recipient as well. And it also allowed you to bounce back entry hazards, which is possibly the biggest use of this ability, because if you bring it in, your opponent goes for Stealth Rock, you bounce it back, and now there's Stealth Rock on your opponent's side of the field instead, which is possibly one of the best things about this ability. Moving on to number 3, I'm gonna have to go with Sheer Force here, because this is possibly one of the best offensive abilities that was introduced into Generation 5. Basically, what this ability does is it increases the power of all moves that have a secondary effect, while also getting rid of that secondary effect entirely, and also allowing you to not take Life Orb recoil on any move that has a secondary effect. So what this ability basically did was allow you to be super powerful if you were using a Life Orb without any negative effects of using it. And one of the most potent Pokemon that was able to make use of this ability has to be Nidoking, just because of its immense type coverage and the immense power that it got through using Sheer Force. Now, there are a ton of other Pokemon that had access to this ability, and it was definitely a very important ability that came about in Generation 5 to make a lot of attackers even more powerful. Moving on to number 2, it's another offensive ability, but I believe to be the best offensive ability introduced in a Generation 5, which is going to go to Moxie. Because if you are a Scarfed Pokemon and you are faster than pretty much everything else on your team, while also being a physical attacker, if you take something down, that is just a sweep right there and you are going to win the battle. And this was possibly one of the most hard things to deal with, especially in the overused tier where Moxie Salamence became such a huge threat because it was faster than pretty much everything that wasn't Scarfed, and it also was one of the most powerful physical attackers in the game. And there are a ton of other Pokemon that made use of this ability, such as Crocodile, or actually Krokorok, I guess would be the final evolution, Gyarados, Pinsir, Heracross, and a ton of other Pokemon that just really benefited from this ability and made them such a threat as a physical attacker because it boosted their physical attack every time they took a Pokemon down. Oh, Honchkrow is another one to mention as well. But the final ability that I feel like was the pretty much best ability introduced in a Generation 5 has to go to Prankster. And this ability is arguably also the most annoying ability to have to deal with, because what it did was allow you to have priority on all of your non-attacking moves. And for some Pokemon, this ability was possibly the most difficult thing to deal with. For example, Liepard and Whimsicott automatically come to mind. Liepard could use Swagger in combination with Thunder Wave and also Foul Play to pretty much just cripple every single attacker in the game. Whimsicott also effectively became one of the best sub-seeders in the game because it could Leech Seed and then always substitute before you had a chance to attack, thus effectively forcing you to have to switch out for fear of just losing all of your health to Leech Seed damage. And another one of the other Pokemon that really made use of this ability, I would have to say, would have to be Tornadus, just because of the fact that if you were about to die, you could do a number of things in terms of setting up weather in the form of Rain Dance, or even setting up a Tailwind to potentially allow the rest of your team to deal some massive damage after you go down. But overall, this ability was probably the best thing introduced in a Generation 5, and also one of the most annoying abilities to deal with, which was why it was so good. Moving on to the best moves of the 5th generation games, there were actually 92 moves introduced into Pokemon Black and White that, at this point, you could hardly even imagine that these moves did not exist before, just because of how commonly they are used nowadays in the current metagame. But kicking it off at number 5, I'm going to have to go with Dragon Tail and Circle Throw, kind of putting them together since they basically do the same thing. But these were the two new phasing moves introduced into the 5th generation games that were unique in the fact that not only did they phase your opponent out, but they also did damage in the process. Now, the bad thing about them is that they couldn't obviously deal with subs, unless they could obviously break the sub, but you couldn't phase out a Pokemon that has a sub, like Roar and Whirlwind are able to. But either way, these two moves became very popularly used, and also could potentially be very useful on Sleep Talk sets and things like that, because it allowed you to actually dish out some pretty good damage while also phasing your opponents and potentially racking up a lot of entry hazard damage, which is something that these moves were very commonly seen on teams that made use of a lot of different entry hazards. So these two definitely come in at number 5 on my list. Moving on to number 4, I would have to go with the new flying moves that were introduced in Generation 5. So these were Hurricane and Acrobatics, were the two most used and powerful flying moves introduced in Generation 5. Hurricane became incredibly popular due to the prevalence of drizzle on rain teams, so Hurricane would always hit with rain up. It was also a move that had a 30% chance to confuse, which was amazing for a move like this because confusion is one of the most difficult statuses in the game to deal with because your opponent could obviously hurt themselves instead of even attacking you. So overall, Hurricane was probably the best of the special, obviously, and then Acrobatics came in as well into 5th gen, being a very powerful flying move that was also most always used in combination with one of the new items introduced, which was the Flying Gem, because it not only boosted the power of your Acrobatics, but still also gave Acrobatics its 110 base power when you don't have an item. And obviously, one of the most popular Pokemon to use with this move would be Archeops, just because of the massive amount of damage it was able to dish out. But also a lot of Pokemon that had Unburden with the combination of Unburden, Flying Gem, and Acrobatics also made heavy use of this new move, such as Drifblim and also Sceptile. Moving on to number 3, I'm going to have to go with Shell Smash, and this is obviously considered to be possibly the most amazing boosting move in the game. I didn't put Quiver Dance on here just because I assumed that Shell Smash was just by far even more superior. It boosts your physical attack by 2 stages, it boosts your special attack by 2 stages, and it boosts your speed by 2 stages, while only lowering your defense and special defense by 1 stage. But more often than not, this was used in combination with a White Herb to pretty much just get rid of that get rid of those defense drops that you received with the Shell Smash. But this is the best boosting move in the game, without a doubt, in my opinion. And there were only a few Pokemon that got much use out of it, because obviously there were only a few Pokemon that were able to learn it. But it created a whole new clause that needed to be established in Generation 5, which was that in the lower tiers you were not allowed to use Shell Smash in combination with Baton Pass, because it was just deemed to be way too powerful. So how's that for a new move introduced into Generation 5? But overall, this move was just a huge threat on any Pokemon that could pack it, and definitely allowed some Pokemon, such as Gorbis, to be used a ton because of how powerful they would become after using one Shell Smash. But moving on to number 2, I'm gonna have to go with Volt Switch here, because this move just became a staple of electric type move pools. Pretty much every electric Pokemon made use of Volt Switch, and it allowed them to now not only dish out a ton of damage in the process, but also switch out, gaining switch initiative to another Pokemon to potentially counter what you switched out into to take a Volt Switch. And this obviously became incredibly popular just because of how popular U-turn was, because of the utility that move also supplies, as well as being one of the main strategies that was essentially implemented in Gen 5, which is known as Volt Turning, because it was just using a ton of Pokemon with Volt Switch and U-turn to pretty much just gain any possible advantage in battle by constantly countering whatever your opponent switched out into to take whatever Volt Switch or U-turn you were going for. So overall, this move just became incredibly widely used and was possibly one of the best moves introduced in Generation 5, especially from an electric type standpoint. And now coming in at number 1, I'm going to have to go with Scald. And this move just pretty much replaced Surf on every single water type in the game that wasn't an offensive water type. Almost every single water type made use of Scald in Gen 5 over Surf, unless obviously they were going with Hydro Pump for damage. But this move is just, in my opinion, the best thing that came out of Generation 5, and it is impossible for me to imagine kind of how the metagame was before this. Well, I mean, I can, but like, it was just so widely used. Bulky waters became even that more bulky because of the fact that they had a 30% chance to burn you every time you switched in on a Scald. So if you wanted to bring in a physical attacker on a Scald, even if it resisted it, you couldn't even take that risk half the time because that physical attacker would now be burned and pretty much be unable to do what it was meant to do for the remainder of the battle. So in my opinion, Scald is definitely the number 1 choice of move for Gen 5, but the others were obviously very useful as well and definitely allowed for some new strategies and offensive possibilities for a ton of different Pokemon in all of the Pokemon games. And now, last but not least, to round things all off, here are my top 5 best Pokemon of the Generation 5 games. And these are actually going to be separated out by tier, so it'll basically turn into the top 1 Pokemon of each tier separated out from Uber all the way down to NU. But to kick things off, we're actually going to start with the Pokemon that went Uber, which is going to be Excadrill, which is probably no surprise to everyone. This Pokemon went Uber so fast that within the first couple months of gameplay, you didn't even see it in the OU tier anymore. Basically, a combination of Sand Rush with amazing type coverage and an amazing physical attack stat, as well as having access to Swords Dance, which basically, if you set up with this thing under Sand, being now at +2 attack and +2 speed, you could probably sweep everything in the tier. Also having access to Rapid Spin to get rid of entry hazards, this Pokemon pretty much had it all. And it is no surprise that it went Uber as quickly as it did, but for those of you that are sort of new to competitive battling, you probably didn't even know that this Pokemon was even once OU because of how powerful this Pokemon was deemed when it first came out. Now obviously there are the counters to this Pokemon, mainly Azumarill having Aqua Jet, which would just kill it outright, but obviously there were some defensive counters as well, such as Slowbro and things like that. But overall, this Pokemon very quickly was deemed to be incredibly powerful and Uber material within the first couple months of competitive gameplay in the Pokemon Black and White games. So it is no surprise that this Pokemon made the Went Uber number 1 list, in my opinion, of 5th gen Pokemon. But now moving all the way down to NU, I would have to say that the 2 most potent NU Pokemon that came out of the 5th generation games would have to be Sawk and Liepard. And it's honestly a surprise to many people, including myself, why these Pokemon still are NU, due to the fact that they are probably some of the most used NU Pokemon in the game and most difficult Pokemon to deal with in the current NU metagame. Sawk obviously was one of the most powerful fighting type physical attackers in the game introduced in a Generation 5. Typically was a scarfed set, but either way, you would be super fast and have super powerful close combats. And for the Pokemon that could counter Sawk's scarf set, such as being able to take those hits, the band set on Sawk pretty much ripped through those Pokemon as well, making it a very, very powerful attacker. It had really good type coverage, especially when Black and White 2 came around, because it gave it access to Ice Punch to allow it to have some more type coverage. And overall, this Pokemon was just a huge offensive threat introduced in a Generation 5, so it is no surprise that it made this list. But from a more defensive but annoying standpoint, Liepard makes this list as well for NU, due to the fact that it was pretty much considered to be one of the most annoying Pokemon introduced in Generation 5. As I mentioned before, with a combination of Prankster, Thunderwave, Swagger, Foul Play, and Substitute, this Pokemon was just a pain in the butt to deal with, as it could potentially sweep your team due to paralysis and confusion. And that was something that a lot of people were just not happy with, especially because it was so easy to do on this Pokemon, and just one turn of hacks gave you or put you at a disadvantage. Another thing about this Pokemon as well is that the fact that it could also potentially be a very powerful special attacker as well, with access to Unburden and Nasty Plot and a variety of different moves. So it was definitely also a potential very big threat from an offensive standpoint, but people more or less just only used it for its Prankster ability. However, I still think that there is a lot to be said about its offensive power. Moving up to RU, I'm going to have to go with Sigilyph here because this Pokemon is pretty much the embodiment of a annoying setup Pokemon. With access to Magic Guard to not only make it immune to status effects or residual damage from status effects, also making it immune to Stealth Rocks, which is something that was huge for this Pokemon since it's naturally weak to it, it was able to pretty much just set up on anything if it got the chance, and even if you had a even better chance to set up, not even just using Sigilyph by itself, it almost guaranteed that you would win the game if your opponent did not have a Dark type or some other Pokemon to just take it out immediately. Basically, with a combination of Psycho Shift to shift burns that you inflicted upon yourself through the use of a Flame Orb, Cosmic Power, Stored Power, and Roost to heal off any damage you received while setting up, this Pokemon was just a huge threat. It could cripple physical attackers, it could boost its own stats, and also diss out one of the most powerful stored powers in the game because of how easy it was to set up with Cosmic Power and how much survivability you got out of having Roost on this Pokemon's moveset. So overall, I would have to say that this is the most powerful RU Pokemon that was introduced in the Generation 5. And then moving on up to UU, I would have to go with Victini here just because this Pokemon was possibly one of the most controversial Pokemon since release due to the fact that it possesses the most powerful physical fire type move in the game in the form of V-Create, and also has a ton of other coverage moves, allowing it to not only run a very powerful Scarf set, which was initially the most common set, also band sets became very common as you could pretty much just dish out a massive amount of damage to anything with V-Create, because even if you resisted it, you still would take like 40% life from this one move, which was absolutely insane from how powerful this Pokemon was. And to the more or less common, but in many other people's opinions, more useful sets, which were the mix sets for Victini, that allows you to pretty much deal with most common counters to Victini of the physical sets that it usually packed. And this would obviously be Pokemon like Rhyperior, which could easily take fire moves, but you could just Grass Knot them. But then lastly, and it is probably of no surprise to anyone else, Ferrothorn would be the OU Pokemon of choice when talking about the most influential Pokemon in the entire 5th Gen metagame. Pretty much, this Pokemon defined OU. Every single Pokemon in the tier started packing Hidden Power Fire just because of Ferrothorn. So how is that for an impact that this Pokemon had? But overall, this was just not only one of the most powerful defensive Pokemon because of its amazing typing, it could also set up entry hazards, and it was just a huge threat to pretty much any offensive Pokemon in the game. But that is it for this video, everyone, so please let me know what you think in your comments, and feel free to subscribe, follow me on Twitch TV at twitch.tv/Rykard3, and also follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/TrainerRykard. But as always, everybody, take care, goodbye, and I will see you all next time.